Well, let's turn now to Yahoo Finance's Jennifer Schonberger, who has more for all of us on that fallout from SVB and, of course, the future for the U.S. banking system. Hey, Jennifer.
Thank you, Rochelle. That's right. With everything that's happened with the failure of Silicon Valley Bank, all eyes are turning to Washington on what happens next. And with that, I want to welcome in the top Democrat on the House Financial Services Committee, Ranking Member Maxine Waters. Congresswoman, welcome to the program. Thank you so much for being here.
Okay, thank you for having me on this morning.
You're trying to get to the bottom of what happened with the failure of Silicon Valley Bank. And just a few weeks before the bank's failure on Friday, we're learning that CEO Greg Becker ended up selling out of stock and stock options and profiting upwards of $2 million. My question is, when you look at what has happened, how much of this is a lack of rules that were in place versus mismanagement?
Well, first of all, the rumors that are circulating about the stock sale, we're certainly going to take a close look at. It may need to be investigated. And I also understand that there were bonuses that may have been given out early. I don't know that to be fact at this point, but we're going to hold hearings as soon as we possibly can and unravel a lot of what we understand happened. But this is all about regulation. And this is all about the fact that at some point in time, there was great advocacy for making sure that the regional banks and the smaller banks didn't have to comply with some of the rules that perhaps would not have allowed them to get into this situation because there would have been stress testing and more oversight and more watching of what was going on. And I certainly think all of that needs to be tightened up.
Congresswoman, do you think, given these reports we're hearing about bonuses, as you alluded to, the potential for executive compensation clawbacks should be on the table?
Absolutely. And as I said, much of what we're dealing with now relative to stock sales and bonuses by top management is rumor. I don't have any facts on that. But we're going to investigate. We're going to have our hearings that will begin to open up what really took place. And everything is on the table at this point.
You said that this is a failure of regulation, of lack of rules that were put in place. What rules do you think need to be put in place to prevent against this? We know the Federal Reserve is conducting an assessment of what happened with the failure of this bank. We know that the head of supervision at the Fed is reassessing capital requirements. Should there be more stringent capital requirements, liquidity rules for small to mid-sized banks, and stress tests on a yearly basis versus every other year?
Yes, what you're alluding to or what you're talking about is what basically we thought we had in place with the Barney Frank, work that was done in order to ensure that we were giving rules or making rules that would make sure the banks were safe and secure. As you know, there was legislation that was promoted basically by the Republicans and a bill that was signed off on by Trump, who said that, they were absolutely pleased that they were deregulating. And I think that is something that really has helped to cause a lack of the kind of oversight, because now the flexibility was there and was given by this legislation to ensure that they didn't have to follow the rules of the bigger banks. And so some of them were trying to protect the regionals and smaller banks and saying that, we were crippling their ability to be successful with the rules that were too tough on these regional banks and smaller banks. And so that legislation was promoted by the Republicans and signed off by Trump in order to relieve the regional banks and the smaller banks of the kind of scrutiny that was needed in order to keep an eye on them.
Should that be repealed?
Oh, absolutely. I think that should be. And I'm not trying to advance the entire agenda that should be taken up to ensure that our banks are as safe as we can make them. But I do know I was involved in that fight, and I led the opposition to that fight. And so I'm very much aware of what took place when we relaxed the rules, when we gave the Fed and others an opportunity to follow the advocacy that was being promoted by Trump and the Republicans. And so I'm absolutely sure that that should be repealed.
In your briefings and conversations with the Federal Reserve and the FDIC leading up to the emergency action that we saw taken, what indication were you given that Silicon Valley Bank, a middle-sized bank, rose to the level of systemic risk that required backstopping all the deposits in the U.S. financial system?
Well, first of all, let us take a look at the Silicon Valley Bank. They was the go-to bank for startups, and they were not diversified. They absolutely spent a lot of their energy, time, and resources in supporting the startups. And as a matter of fact, one of the interesting things is that 90% of their depositors were uninsured. And so one of the things I'm going to be looking at, and others will be looking at, is what role did any of this play in bringing them to the point where the bank was in collapse? One of the things that I do know is as we deal with inflation and as, interest rates have to be increased, you have to play that against the bonds and securities that were held by the bank and what they were worth. And what they discovered was that those were securities that had low interest rates, and now the interest rates had raised substantially. And so they couldn't sell off those securities unless they took a big cut, and they did. They took a big cut and discounted, those assets that they had because of the interest rates had changed. And so that was one of the problems with what took place.
Along with Silicon Valley Bank's failure, we saw Circle's stablecoin break the buck. Their management has been calling on Congress urgently to pass legislation to regulate stablecoins. I know that you have been working with Chair Patrick McHenry on stablecoin legislation. Where does that legislation stand now, Congresswoman? How far apart are you on that?
Well, actually, I believe the legislation could be passed when we get back to Congress in a few days. We had just about solved all of our problems. The only thing that interfered, I think, with its passage was the anticipation that the House was going to change and it was going to be in the hands of the Republicans, and they should take charge rather than those of us on the Democratic side that they believe would not be in charge, and I would not be the chair anymore. And so I think it's ready to go. And we had resolved most of our issues, and I think we can get it done.
So we could see passage of this bill within the next month or so, next couple of months, by later this spring? What's the timetable, you think?
Oh, I'm not going to give you a timetable because there's always uncertainty in negotiations and the way that things get done in Congress. But I want to tell you that I'm focused on it. Mr. McHenry is focused on it. We have a bipartisan effort that we put on it, and we're going to do it as quickly as we possibly can.
Congresswoman, have you spoken to Chair McHenry on the Silicon Valley Bank situation and what should be done here? He seems, based on his statements, to be a bit more reserved that the regulations that are currently in place should be enough. He had some misconceptions about social media and the role that played perhaps in this crisis. But have you talked to him? How do you see working with him on this issue?
Well, as you know, when the facts come out, I do believe some of those who are reticent about the legislation that may be needed are going to change their minds. When the facts come out and they take a look at how the bank operated, and when they take a look at what that balance sheet was that should have been known, that their assets were not as valuable, when they look at all of this, I don't think that there will be any politics about, I think it's all right, and I think it's the internet, I think it's Twitter, I think all that stuff is going to go out of the window because the facts are going to prove that we need to tighten up on the regulations and that the legislation that allowed the regional banks and the smaller banks not to have to comply with the tough rules of the larger banks is going to change things. And so I'm optimistic that we're going to get it done. And those kind of comments do not bother me at this point.
And one last question for you, Congresswoman, switching gears a bit on the debt ceiling. I know you sent a letter to Chair McHenry urging him to take this matter seriously and hold a hearing. Have you heard back from him on that? What are you hearing? What's the latest from your Republican colleagues on raising the debt ceiling?
Well, we are working very hard to get them to understand we've got to raise the debt ceiling. And as you know, Yellen, our Treasury Secretary, has been maneuvering and figuring out how she could pay bills as they come due, but that's going to be over by June. We've got to raise the debt ceiling. And I don't believe that my Republican colleagues have moved quick enough since we've been back in session to focus on the fact that we cannot default on the debt. We cannot close the government down. This is serious. And I don't think they're taking it seriously enough at this point. And the way that they rolled out legislation all about socialism and those kinds of things is a waste of time. We've got to focus on raising the debt limit and being credit worthy so that we can keep our country going in the way that it should be going. And so we're going to press hard. I'm pressing hard, and I want them to realize that this has got to be done quickly.
Congresswoman Waters, want to thank you so much for your insights. So appreciate it. Hope to speak with you again soon.
Well, you're so welcome, and thank you for having me on.